A sleek black luxury car glided along the narrow country road, the hum of its engine cutting through the stillness of the late afternoon. Victoria, the driver, adjusted her sunglasses and tapped impatiently on the steering wheel, her thoughts scattered between meetings she was already late for and the ever-growing list of things that demanded her attention. Suddenly, the engine coughed violently and died, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. She tried turning the key again and again, but the car refused to respond. The frustration bubbled inside her, a rare feeling she was unaccustomed to. Looking around, she realized she was completely alone. Rolling fields of green stretched endlessly on either side, broken only by the occasional fence or lone tree. The sun dipped lower toward the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. Panic began to nibble at the edges of her composure. No cell signal. No nearby houses. No passing cars. Just miles of emptiness and the faint hum of insects in the tall grass. Then, in the distance, she saw a solitary figure moving slowly among the crops of a small farm. A man, probably in his 50s, stooped over the soil, hands covered in dirt, working with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime tending the earth. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she should approach him. But with no other options, she grabbed her bag, smoothed her perfectly pressed blouse, and started walking toward the stranger, her heels sinking slightly in the soft dirt road. As she drew closer, Victoria's anxiety mixed with curiosity. This was a world so different from the high-rise offices and luxury hotels she frequented, yet here she was, completely dependent on someone whose life she could barely imagine. The farmer, Thomas, looked up from his work, squinting against the late afternoon sun. His hands were rough and calloused, evidence of decades spent tilling the soil, but his eyes were sharp and observant. When he noticed Victoria approaching, he straightened slightly, studying her carefully. She was impeccably dressed, her posture rigid, and her expression carried a mix of frustration and urgency. He had seen cars break down before, but never a woman who seemed so out of place in this quiet countryside. Victoria quickened her pace, waving her hands slightly as if to bridge the gap between their worlds. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but tinged with anxiety. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but my car has broken down, and I don't have any cell service. Could you please help me?" She tried to keep her tone calm, though her heart raced. Thomas nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag he had tucked into his pocket. He didn't flinch at her expensive clothes or the delicate way she carried herself. "Let's take a look," he said simply. There was no judgment in his voice, no hint of awe or condescension, just straightforward practicality. He motioned for her to open the car hood. Victoria followed his instructions, her fingers brushing against the sleek metal as she lifted it. Thomas leaned over the car engine, his sleeves rolled up, revealing arms tanned and strong from years of labor. He worked with deliberate patience, checking each component as if it were part of a puzzle. Victoria watched closely, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She had expected a mechanic in a uniform, tools laid out neatly, efficiency measured in minutes. Instead, she saw a man whose hands bore the marks of the earth, yet moved with surprising skill and precision. "This fuel line here," Thomas explained, pointing to a thin, worn hose, "it's cracked. That's why the engine keeps stalling. I can patch it for now, but it will need replacing soon." He spoke plainly, avoiding technical jargon, yet his confidence was unmistakable. Victoria nodded, impressed not just by his knowledge, but by the way he explained it without making her feel inferior. As he worked, Victoria couldn't help but notice the contrast between his environment and hers. Outside, the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds formed a calm soundtrack, a stark contrast to the constant buzz of city traffic she was used to. The smell of soil mixed with engine oil reminded her of something almost forgotten, the satisfaction of hands-on work, of creating or fixing something with effort and care. Thomas paused to wipe his brow, catching Victoria's curious gaze. "It's not always about fancy tools or money," he said, tightening a bolt with measured force. "Sometimes, all you need is patience and knowing what to look for." His voice carried quiet authority, yet it was warm, devoid of arrogance. Victoria felt a twinge of humility. Here was a man whose wealth was measured not in currency, but in skill, knowledge, and experience, qualities that could not be bought. Minutes passed, the engine gradually becoming more cooperative under his careful adjustments. Victoria felt a strange sense of admiration growing inside her, mixed with gratitude. The man who had seemed so ordinary at first glance was extraordinary in his own way. She realized that this unexpected encounter was turning into more than just a mechanical repair. It was a subtle lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet dignity of honest work. Victoria stepped back from the car, brushing her hands nervously on her skirt. She had expected a simple, transactional interaction. He would fix the car, she would pay him, and that would be the end. Instead, she found herself looking at a man who had given his time, skill, and patience without asking for anything in return. The realization settled on her with surprising weight. "Thank you," she said softly, almost in awe. "I don't know how I can repay you." Thomas shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "No need," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm happy to help. That's enough for me." His words were simple, but they carried a depth that Victoria hadn't expected. She looked at him, truly looked, and noticed the quiet pride in his stance, the calm certainty that comes from living a life in harmony with one's values. He didn't need her money. His satisfaction came from helping, from using his hands and knowledge to solve a problem. Victoria felt a pang of humility. In her world, almost everything came with a price, and favors were measured in currency or social leverage. Here, on this quiet country road, she was confronted with a reality where generosity and expertise existed without expectation of reward. It was a lesson she hadn't realized she needed. She reached into her bag, hesitated, and then slowly withdrew a thick envelope of cash, pressing it into his hands. "Please, at least take something for your time," she insisted, her voice carrying a mix of insistence and vulnerability. Thomas looked at the envelope, then back at Victoria, and shook his head again. "I can't take this. You'll have your car back, and that's enough. Just remember, sometimes helping someone, even a stranger, is the richest reward you can have." His eyes met hers, steady and sincere. Victoria felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of gratitude, respect, and the unsettling awareness that she had been humbled. Victoria slid into the driver's seat, the engine purring beneath her hands. As she eased the car back onto the dirt road, she stole a glance through the rearview mirror. Thomas was already bent over his crops again, the sun casting long shadows across the fields. There was something quietly majestic about him, the way he moved with purpose and calm, so different from the frenetic pace of her own life. She felt a strange mix of admiration and humility welling up inside her. For the first time that day, Victoria allowed herself to breathe. The tension that had gripped her since the car broke down began to dissolve. In its place came reflection. She realized that so much of her life had been transactional. Every favor, every conversation, every smile measured in some form of currency or return. Yet here was Thomas, whose wealth was measured not in money, but in skill, patience, and the quiet satisfaction of helping another human being. It was a stark, almost jarring contrast. She thought about the words he had spoken. Sometimes helping someone, even a stranger, is the richest reward you can have. They lingered in her mind, echoing against the walls of her thoughts. How often had she rushed past opportunities to help others because it didn't advance her agenda or benefit her materially? How often had she overlooked the simple, profound act of generosity? Thomas's humility and competence had given her far more than a fixed car. It had offered her a glimpse into a life lived with purpose and integrity. As she drove through the winding countryside, the sky ablaze with sunset, Victoria felt a shift deep within her. Gratitude replaced frustration, and a subtle sense of wonder crept into her thoughts. She realized that wealth alone could never teach such lessons. It required human connection, sincerity, and sometimes, being open to learning from someone whose world seemed completely different. Her mind replayed the scene over and over. Thomas's steady hands, his gentle explanations, the unassuming pride in his work. By the time she reached the main road leading back toward the city, Victoria's pace had slowed, both literally and metaphorically. She felt a sense of calm she rarely experienced in her high-powered life. This brief encounter on a deserted country road had left an indelible mark on her, a reminder that true richness lies in character, kindness, and the courage to help without expectation. She knew she would carry this lesson with her, allowing it to shape the way she approached her work, her relationships, and her understanding of what it truly meant to be wealthy. Victoria drove on, the city skyline still far ahead but the glow of the setting sun casting warm light across her dashboard. Her mind kept drifting back to Thomas, to the simplicity and dignity of his life. She thought of his calloused hands, the calm certainty in his voice, and the way he had refused her money with such quiet conviction. That moment had unsettled her in the best possible way, reminding her that some things, honesty, kindness, and integrity, were far more valuable than anything money could buy. As the road stretched before her, Victoria felt an unusual sense of peace. The stress of her deadlines and meetings seemed trivial compared to the lesson she had learned on that dusty country road. For the first time in a long while, she understood that wealth was not a measure of worth or happiness. True wealth, she realized, was the ability to give and to help without expecting anything in return, and to live a life guided by principles rather than possessions. Meanwhile, back on his small farm, Thomas returned to his vegetables with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He didn't need recognition, praise, or compensation. Helping Victoria had been its own reward. He glanced at the fading light spilling across the fields and smiled to himself. In his simple, steady way, he had made a difference, both to a stranger and, perhaps unknowingly, to the person who might carry his lesson into a world far removed from the one he knew. Victoria's encounter with Thomas lingered in her mind long after the car had been repaired and the city was in view. She began to notice the small moments in her own life where she could practice patience, generosity, and humility. She found herself appreciating the people who helped without expectation and began rethinking her own definition of success. The brief crossing of their worlds, a wealthy woman and a humble farmer, had created a ripple of understanding and transformation that neither of them could fully measure, but both felt deeply. As night fell, Victoria parked her car and stepped out, the city lights sparkling before her. She took a deep breath and smiled, carrying with her a newfound perspective, that true richness was not in material things, but in connection, empathy, and the courage to help others selflessly. And somewhere in the quiet countryside, Thomas continued his work, untroubled by fame or fortune, secure in the knowledge that even the simplest acts of kindness could leave a lasting mark on the world.